We will be able to first make the point that some of the redacted stuff doesn't have to, much of the redacted stuff doesn't have to be redacted, and we'll have chapter and verse on that. And second, we will be prepared to argue that in court. But again, our number one ally in this is the American people. And they are going to demand that it be released. And when we say this and this and this shouldn't have been redacted, what are they hiding there? It's going to increase a lot of heat on them.
And clearly, as Senator Schumer knows, having met with them, the victims are not also going to allow this to happen.
Right.
They're going to be leading the way. They want to know what's in these documents.
Yep.
The victims are already filing lawsuits using the...
You just heard them say it. You just heard them say the quiet part out loud. Senator Schumer standing there asking what happens if the Epstein files are so heavily redacted. There's nothing to see. And Senator Klobuchar reminding us that the victims aren't going to allow this to happen, that they're going to be leading the way, that they want to know what's in these documents, and Senator Wyden confirming that the victims are already filing lawsuits using the information we've gotten, that they are not going to let this just go by the board. And I need you to understand what is happening right now, not next week, not next month, but right now at this precise moment in our democratic experiment, because the law requires the Department of Justice to release the files by Friday, December 19th, and in 3 days President Trump has a choice. Follow the law and release the files, or break the law and continue to hide the truth from the American people. And you need to understand the stakes here, because this is not about one pedophile financier who died in a cell. This is about the entire rotten architecture of elite impunity that has turned our two-tier justice system into something far more sinister, into a mechanism of social control that protects the powerful while crushing everyone else beneath the weight of their privilege. And before we go any further, let me tell you what's coming in this analysis, because I'm going to take you through the historical precedent that explains exactly why this moment matters. I'm going to show you how the FBI spent over 4,737 overtime hours, costing the U.S. government over $851,000 to redact files related to the Epstein investigation, nearly $1 million of your money spent on hiding the truth from you. I'm going to connect this to the systemic failure of accountability that has characterized elite crime for decades, and I'm going to show you why the victims filing lawsuits right now represent the only real threat to this carefully constructed wall of protection that shields the most depraved among the ruling class. So buckle up, because this is about to get intense, and you're going to understand exactly why Schumer is right to be suspicious, and why we should all be absolutely enraged right now. Listen to what Schumer says in that clip. Listen carefully to the rhetoric, because he fully expects Trump, Bondi, and their minions to dodge, delay, or partially release these files. And if they release some documents and hide others, the American people will see right through it. And this is where we need to talk about what scholars call crimes of the powerful, because this isn't some abstract legal theory. This is the lived reality of how justice works in America, when you have enough money and enough connections to make the machinery of government work for you instead of against you. Epstein's case represents not only individual misconduct, but also a broader structural pattern in which elites are shielded from the forms of accountability that govern ordinary citizens. And through his financial role, philanthropic projects, and cultivated connections, Epstein gained entry into the networks described as the power elite, and his treatment by the courts exemplified the insulation that was central to elite privilege. And when you understand that framework, when you grasp that this is systemic rather than anomalous, you begin to see why this fight over redactions matters so profoundly. Now I want you to consider the sheer audacity of what we've learned about the redaction process, because this isn't just bureaucratic procedure. This is active cover-up happening in real time, with institutional resources deployed specifically to hide information from the public. The FBI spent at least $851 the week of March 17, 2025, in overtime pay for 934 agents mobilized to process and redact the Epstein files as part of a project called EPSTEIN Transparency Project 2025, with FBI personnel devoting 4,737 hours of overtime to the project between January and July 2025, with more than 70% of that occurring in March. And let me be absolutely clear about what this means, because when a government agency mobilizes nearly 1,000 agents and spends close to $1 million in overtime specifically to redact documents, that is not transparency. That is the opposite of transparency. That is elaborate institutional machinery devoted to obscuring truth rather than revealing it. And here's where it gets even more explosive, because FBI Director Kash Patel sent about 1,000 special agents to the Bureau's Central Records Complex in Winchester, Virginia, for crash course redaction training on the Epstein Transparency Project, also called the Special Redaction Project. And do you hear the Orwellian doublespeak in that language? Calling it a transparency project when it's literally a redaction project, when the entire purpose is to hide information, to black out names, to protect the powerful from the consequences of their associations with a convicted sex trafficker who authorities believe abused more than 1,000 girls and women across decades of operation. This is the banality of evil made manifest in bureaucratic process. This is how institutions launder corruption through procedural legitimacy, and this is exactly why the victims and their lawyers are absolutely right to be preparing for battle in the courts. Let me paint you the fuller picture of what's at stake, because as of November 2025, the Department of Justice's unreleased Epstein documents consist of nearly 100,000 pages as well as 40 computers, 70 CDs, 26 storage drives, and 6 recording devices which contain a collective 300 gigabytes of data, and physical evidence in the FBI's possession also includes photographs, travel logs, employee lists, blueprints of Epstein's island and Manhattan home, a logbook of visitors to Epstein's private island, and a list of names, 100,000 pages and 300 gigabytes of data, documenting a sex trafficking operation that involved powerful figures across multiple continents, and they want to redact it, they want to hide it, they want to protect the names of people who were associated with or potentially complicit in crimes against children, and we're supposed to just accept that this is necessary for national security or ongoing investigations, when the Justice Department and FBI concluded in a memo that there was no evidence that Epstein blackmailed powerful figures, kept a client list, or was murdered, with investigators reviewing footage of Epstein's prison cell on the night he died and finding no one entered the area. So if there's no blackmail and no client list according to their own memo, then what exactly are they hiding in those 100,000 pages? And this is where the victims become the heroes of this story, because all of the survivors that CNN interviewed said they support the entirety of the Epstein files being released once and for all, but that redactions must be made to protect Epstein's victims, with survivors stating that what is most important is that the names of survivors are handled with care and redacted, and that nobody's personal or identifying information is released, but what they really want to see is the names of these perpetrator. And this is the reasonable position. This is the ethical position. Protect the victims and expose the perpetrators. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is a redaction process that the government does tend to over-redact, never under-redact, because you're trained to over-redact, and if there's any question you just redact, and you hope the other side doesn't call it into question, which is exactly why Schumer and the Democratic caucus are preparing for legal battle, because they know what's coming. Now let's talk about the two-tier justice system that this case exemplifies, because this is not a new phenomenon, but it has reached a level of brazenness that should shock the conscience of anyone who believes in democratic equality under law. The indulgence granted to powerful actors suggests that the justice system functions less as a neutral arbiter and more as an institution embedded in elite networks of protection, making this a useful lens for studying how certain individuals evade accountability. And when you look at the Epstein case through this framework, you see how his past associations with many of the world's most powerful and wealthy people, including Trump, coupled with the decades of failure by the justice system to hold him accountable, have made Epstein a prime example of systemic corruption. And this isn't hyperbole, this isn't partisan rhetoric, this is scholarly consensus about how power operates in contemporary America. Consider the lawsuits that victims are already filing, because this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of actual accountability. 12 accusers of Jeffrey Epstein sued the FBI for failure to protect them in a complaint filed in federal court in the Southern District of New York, alleging the FBI had specific information about Epstein, with the lawsuit seeking to hold the FBI responsible for failure to act when it absolutely should have, and these women are arguing that the FBI's repeated and continued failures, delays, and inaction allowed Jeffrey Epstein to continue his sex trafficking operation for more than 20 years, with the suit claiming the FBI's negligence resulted in the continued sexual abuse of 12 alleged victims. 20 years of FBI inaction, while girls and young women were being trafficked and abused. 20 years during which an individual told the FBI in 1996 that Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell had sexually abused her, and there were other victims, with the FBI allegedly hanging up on her and not investigating the report. And between 1996 and 2005, the FBI continued to receive direct reports, complaints, and tips concerning illegal sex trafficking, but failed to act upon and investigate the complaints. And this is institutional complicity. This is structural protection of a predator who had the right connections and enough money to be effectively immune from consequences. And here's what should make your blood boil, because a September 2025 Marist poll surveying 1,477 adult Americans found that 90% of Americans answered that they wanted at least some of the Epstein files released with the victims' names redacted, with 77% stating they wanted all of the Epstein files to be released, and 84% of Democrats, 67% of Republicans, and 83% of independents answered that they wanted all of the Epstein files to be released, and 84% of Democrats, 67% of Republicans, 90% of Americans want transparency. This is overwhelming bipartisan consensus that transcends our political divisions, and yet the institutional machinery of government is mobilizing to deny the American people what they have clearly demanded. After months of waiting, months of Republican delay after so many failed attempts from Donald Trump to hide the truth, the Epstein Files Transparency Act is headed to his desk, but the job is not done. The vote is not the end, it is only the beginning. And once the president signs the bill, he must apply and execute it faithfully with no funny business from Donald Trump. He must not use the excuse of frivolous investigations to release some Epstein documents while intentionally hiding others that deserve to be seen by the American public, because this is not an invitation for Donald Trump to pick and choose his version of the truth. This bill is a command for the president to be fully transparent, to come fully clean, and to provide full honesty to the American people, even if he doesn't want to. Let me take you deeper into the historical context, because you need to understand that this moment is the culmination of decades of elite impunity that has corroded democratic legitimacy and created the conditions for authoritarian backlash. Elite impunity created Trump, because as a businessman who for decades didn't just cross legal and ethical lines but obliterated them, his political prominence is owed to that inability to send white-collar criminals to jail. And as a political candidate in the era of no accountability, he capitalized on the frustration and anger people feel in a rigged system, the kind that makes them turn to demagogues who promise to fight for them to end the rip-offs to right the wrongs. And this is the dialectical tragedy of our moment, that the system's failure to hold elites accountable has created the space for authoritarian populism to flourish by channeling legitimate rage about injustice toward scapegoats and culture war distractions, rather than toward systemic reform. And here's where we need to talk about what transparency actually means in practice, versus what it means in propaganda, because the DOJ's February 2025 release was framed as a declassification move led by Attorney General Bondi and the FBI, with the DOJ saying the tranche represented documents related to investigations and indictments, 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 related. But critics inside and outside Congress said much of the material had already circulated via leaks and court filings, and that the initial tranche contained little new information, with AP and other outlets describing the rollout as showmanship rather than substance, performance rather than accountability. And this is exactly the pattern that Schumer is warning about when he talks about the administration potentially dodging and delaying and partially releasing files. Now I want you to consider the sheer scope of institutional resources that have been devoted to protecting powerful people from exposure in this case, because it's not just the redaction overtime, it's the entire architecture of legal and bureaucratic obstacles that have been erected. The clause that appears most concerning allows the DOJ to redact information that would jeopardize an active federal investigation or ongoing prosecution, and President Donald Trump has ordered Bondi to open an investigation into Epstein's connections to 3 prominent Democrats, including former President Bill Clinton, former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, and the billionaire founder of LinkedIn Reid Hoffman, which will allow Bondi to withhold anything that she considers relevant to that investigation. And do you see the circular logic here? Do you see how opening investigations becomes a mechanism to justify indefinite redaction? How the power to prosecute becomes the power to hide information under the guise of protecting ongoing probes? And this is exactly why the Attorney General can withhold or redact any information that would jeopardize an active federal investigation or prosecution. And Trump last week called on the DOJ to investigate Epstein's ties to former President Bill Clinton officials at JP Chase and others, conveniently opening investigations that then become the rationale for keeping documents hidden. Let me connect this to the broader crisis of democratic legitimacy, because this isn't just about one case of elite criminality. This is about whether democratic institutions can function as mechanisms of accountability, or whether they have been so thoroughly captured by elite interests that they serve primarily to legitimate and protect power. Accountability gaps are not only legal failures but also democratic failures, and when elites remain untouchable, trust in law and government weakens, making the concept of the power elite a powerful tool for understanding contemporary justice, while the Epstein case reveals the urgent need to rethink how institutions can prevent privilege from distorting accountability in democratic societies. And this is the fundamental question facing our polity right now, whether the mechanisms of democratic accountability can be revived, or whether we have crossed a threshold into a post-accountability regime where power simply protects power through institutional means. And here's what makes the victims' role so crucial in this fight, because they represent the only force with both the moral authority and the legal standing to challenge this wall of protection. In the 5 years since sex offender Jeffrey Epstein first walked into a Manhattan courtroom, his victims have hastened the public downfalls of a British prince and other prominent men, provided key testimony that led to the imprisonment of 2 alleged accomplices, and reached out-of-court settlements totaling more than $500 million. Yet many of the survivors are pressing on and continue to push forward in quests for justice, transparency, and accountability from institutions and individuals who allegedly aided, enabled, or turned a blind eye to the late financier's criminal behavior. In the first half of 2024 alone, lawsuits on behalf of Epstein's victims have been filed against the Federal Bureau of Investigation, current and former government officials in the U.S., which means the legal battlefield is already active, and the victims are not waiting for the government to voluntarily release information. They are using every legal tool available to force disclosure. Now let's talk about what happens if the administration defies the law and refuses to release the files, or releases them in such heavily redacted form that they're meaningless, because if the administration withholds some documents unlawfully, we will know. If they abuse narrow exemptions to hide the truth, we will know, and there will be serious legal and political consequences. But what are those consequences really? What can Congress do when the executive branch simply refuses to comply with the law? And this is where we enter dangerous constitutional territory, because
if they don't release the documents, there's going to be such an outcry from one end of America to the other that they'll be forced to do it. And public sentiment is everything, with rarely so many different political wings of each party coming together to say we need this, and they believe they'll be required to do it while pursuing every legal, legislative, and administrative way to get this done. But public pressure will be everything. On this invocation of Lincoln and public sentiment is both inspiring and terrifying, because it suggests that formal legal mechanisms may be insufficient, and that only sustained mass pressure can overcome institutional resistance. I need you to understand the class dynamics at work here, because this is fundamentally about who gets protected and who gets prosecuted in a society where
we have a system of justice that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And the Epstein case crystallizes this with perfect clarity, because Trump's accountant Alan Weisselberg served 99 days in Rikers for tax fraud, while thousands of black men within the same walls remain there for longer just awaiting trial, with 9 out of 10 detainees at Rikers Island, which is made up of 90.1% people of color, not yet convicted of a crime, while Black Panther activists have spent over 4 or 5 decades incarcerated, aging and dying behind bars or in solitary confinement, as the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers of the Jan. 6 insurrection who destroyed property at the Capitol and threatened the life of the vice president were almost all given sentences of just a few years, and this is the reality of the two-tier system, where violence against the state by right-wing insurrectionists gets measured in months, while black radicals die in prison, and poor people of color languish for years without trial. And yet when it comes to elite predators like Epstein, the machinery of protection kicks into overdrive. And let me be absolutely clear about what's happening with these redactions, because there are legitimate reasons to protect victim identities, and there are illegitimate reasons to protect perpetrator identities, and the entire fight is about ensuring that the redaction process serves the former purpose rather than the latter. The bill says the Attorney General may withhold or redact records that include victims' names, medical files, and identifying information, as well as child sex abuse materials, and any information that would jeopardize an active federal investigation or prosecution, plus images of death, abuse or injury, and classified information. And these are facially reasonable categories, but the devil is in the implementation, because the DOJ can't withhold or redact records on the basis of embarrassment, reputational harm, or political sensitivity toward any government official, public figure, or foreign dignitary, which means that powerful people's desire to avoid embarrassment is not supposed to be a legitimate ground for redaction. But do we trust this administration to honor that limitation when the Bureau's FOIA team, tasked with conducting a final review of the records' blacked-out names before higher-ups said last month that releasing the documents would not be appropriate or warranted. Here's what's coming in the next few days, and why you need to pay attention, because this is a crucial test of whether democratic accountability mechanisms can function at all in the face of elite resistance. The deadline is Friday, December 19th, and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is leading the push for the Trump administration to follow through with releasing documents related to Jeffrey Epstein, with the pressure campaign coming after President Trump signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act into law last month, which compels the Justice Department to release files and grand jury testimonies related to its probe of the disgraced financier's sex trafficking case, with the deadline to release the information being Friday, and the Senate putting President Trump and his administration on notice, demanding that they must release the complete Epstein files or Democrats will see them in court. And this threat of litigation is not empty rhetoric, because the victims and their lawyers have already demonstrated their willingness to fight in court, and they have won significant victories, including JP Chase and Deutsche Bank, each settling lawsuits brought by survivors for $290 million and $75 million respectively, with no admission of wrongdoing, over $1/3 billion extracted from institutions that facilitated Epstein's operation, which proves that legal pressure works when it's sustained and strategic. And I want you to think about the institutional corruption revealed by the FBI's handling of this case over decades, because for over 2 decades the Federal Bureau of Investigation permitted Jeffrey Epstein to sex traffic and sexually abuse scores of children and young women by failing to do the job the American people expected of it, and that the FBI's own rules and regulations required, to investigate the reports, tips, and evidence it had of rampant sexual abuse and sex trafficking by Epstein, and protect the young women and children who fell victim to him. And this is not just negligence, this is systematic institutional failure that rises to the level of complicity, and between 2006 and 2008, JP Chase contacted the federal government on numerous occasions regarding Epstein's transactions and concern about child prostitution, which means the FBI had financial institutions flagging suspicious activity consistent with sex trafficking and still failed to act decisively, and this raises the obvious question of why. Why would a law enforcement agency fail to investigate when presented with evidence of crimes against children? And the only plausible answer is that someone was being protected, that Epstein's connections made him effectively untouchable. Let me bring this to a conclusion by connecting it to the broader political moment we're living through, because the fight over the Epstein files is a microcosm of the larger struggle over whether democratic institutions can be reclaimed for public purposes or whether they have been so thoroughly colonized by elite interests that they're beyond redemption. Republicans have spent months trying to protect Donald Trump and hide what's in the files, and Americans are tired of waiting and are demanding to see the truth. And this bipartisan public demand for transparency colliding with institutional resistance to disclosure is the fundamental conflict of our time. It's the same dynamic we see with police violence and qualified immunity, with corporate malfeasance and deferred prosecution agreements, with financial fraud and too big to jail. It's the pattern of power protecting power through institutional means, while ordinary people bear the costs and the consequences. So what do we do? What is to be done in this moment, when we're staring down the barrel of likely heavy redaction or outright defiance of the transparency law? And the answer is what it always is: sustained organized collective action, to impose costs on the powerful for their resistance to accountability. The victims are showing the way by filing lawsuits, by speaking publicly, by refusing to accept the narrative that some people are simply too important to be held accountable for association with a sex trafficker. One survivor, Jana Lisa Jones, said watching their push for transparency turn political has been painful to watch, stating they are hearing the administration say they intend to investigate various Democrats who were friends with Epstein, and she begged President Trump to please stop making this political because it is not about him, asking him to start acting like their president, and saying she voted for him but his behavior on this issue has been a national embarrassment. And this appeal from a survivor cuts through all the partisan noise to the moral core of the issue. This is about justice for victims, not about political advantage for powerful men. The files need to be released, the perpetrators need to be exposed, the institutions that failed need to be reformed, and the victims need to be believed and supported, and anything less than full transparency consistent with protecting victim identities is a continuation of the cover-up that has characterized this case from the beginning. Donald Trump needs to release the Epstein files. Stop hiding, stop delaying, come clean with the American people, and if he doesn't, the question will only get louder and louder and louder. Trump, what the hell are you trying to hide? And that question needs to echo from every platform and every podium until it becomes impossible to ignore, because this is about whether we live in a democracy where the powerful can be held accountable, or an oligarchy where wealth and connections place you above the law. and if we accept the latter, we have no right to call ourselves a free people. The victims are fighting, Schumer and Senate Democrats are preparing for legal battle, and we need to support them with the full force of public pressure, because this is one of those moments when the character of our democracy hangs in the balance, when we either demand accountability or acquiesce to elite impunity, and there is no neutral ground, no comfortable middle position. You are either on the side of transparency and justice, or you are complicit in the cover-up, and history will remember which side each of us chose in this fight.